Okay. Um, this is Sarah Milligan with the Oklahoma Oral History Research Program at the Oklahoma State University Library. I am talking today with Ed Walkiewicz, who is the former director of the Doel Reed Center. This project is part of the documenting history of the Doel Reed Center, which is part of Oklahoma State University. Today's date is November 2nd, 2022. And that's about as formal as we get. Okay, so I did want to start first with just some of your general background. So a little bit about just where you're from and how you ended up coming to OSU. Just for
Well, I'm from the New York area originally. I grew up on Long Island. My father was a New York City firefighter, uh, so I actually grew up in a very different kind of geographical environment. I grew up a mile from the ocean, so I spent a whole lot of my childhood and most of my senior year in high school on the beach. So very different from Oklahoma and New Mexico both. I went to Yale as an undergraduate and then went to Columbia where I met my wife, and we both uh, decided we weren't really pleased with Columbia. She had come from Stanford and I had come from Yale, as I mentioned. We were both used to a much more personal kind of educational environment, and Columbia was kind of much more like a factory. So my wife grew up here in Santa Fe, and we decided to move to Santa Fe. And we spent a year working in New York, then moved to Santa Fe. And I finished my doctorate at the University of New Mexico. I applied for a job um, via the MLA job list at Oklahoma State, and we both spent the next 30 years in Stillwater. My wife was the senior English teacher at Stillwater High for many years. Um, and it was actually much more well known in town than I was. I, I would go into Walmart or someplace and present my credit card and be asked by the checkout person, "Oh, do you know Mrs. Walkowitz?" And I was always tempted to say no. It's a really common name in, in Stillwater. um, but so we moved back. We decided to retire and move back, and that's when I first became involved with the Doel Reed Center. Bruce Crowder, who was associate dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at the time, mentioned to me that I might want to become involved since I was going to be retiring to Santa Fe, and so I, Sally and I went up. My wife Sally and I went up um, in June of 2010, and uh, met with Sally McCorkle, who was the first director, um, and she asked us if we would mind um, occupying Martha Reed while Sally, was having the door to the studio rekeyed because she misplaced the key and didn't want Martha to know that that had happened. So that's how we met Martha Reed. And we spent about an hour visiting with Martha. Um, as was always the case, one had to be announced and wait until Martha felt that she was presentable. We on the portal, and I learned later that we were really favored, that many people had to wait much longer than that. So we spent a really very interesting, delightful hour with Martha and with Lucy, who was her caretaker at the time. And my wife has always been somebody who sews and is interested in sewing and dressmaking and that kind of thing. And so a discussion ensued, and Martha and Lucy started pulling out garments that Martha had designed, and that were part of the Martha of Taos line, and blouses she had gotten in Turkey and things like that. So it was a really wonderful afternoon. And it turned out we were very lucky since Martha passed away the following December. And then when Sally stepped down as director, I was asked by the Dean of Arts and Sciences if I would take over as director since I was not that far away in Santa Fe. and that's how I really became involved.
Oh, okay, that makes sense. I was kind of curious how the early, leadership was taking place, because it seems like from what I understand, Sally McCorkle was really involved in helping everything get set up during the sort of transition period. But also there was a lot of physical renovations that need to happen, and like
Oh,
a lot of
complete,
early work before you got started too, right?
complete uh, overhaul of the three buildings and the property. When I took over, the only thing that had been done is some demo work. Um, and all three of, in fact, I taught a class along with a faculty member from the art department that summer of 2011. And we couldn't use any of the facilities on the property. So we actually taught the class at SMU Taos, which is a really large campus. I think they can house something like 125 students for the summer school. And it's in the Kit Carson National Forest, um, up the high road from the Doel Reed Center. You just keep going on the high road as you would if you were heading to Santa Fe, the back way, as people say. And so we actually taught at SMU. Angie Peel and I taught classes that summer at SMU Taos. Um,
So if I guess it was sort of implied, but to clarify, you became the director in 2011. Is that
correct.
correct?
Uh-huh. Yeah, in summer of 2011, with the new fiscal year, I took over and stayed in that position till 2015.
Okay. Um, I'm curious, how things were communicated to you about like what the vision for that center was.
And it was very vague at first, and a lot of it were things that I kind of came up with and proposed, and talked to the steering committee about, and talked to the dean's office about, and very quickly talked to Burns and Ann about. The Hargises have always been intimately involved with the Doel Reed Center, and it undoubtedly would not exist without the support that they provided over the years. Um, and so, I would bounce ideas off of them as well. Um, so basically, when I came in, the property was a shambles. Martha loved the property, but did not take care of it. And that was in large measure because she couldn't afford to take care of it. When I took over, there are three structures. Um, what was then called Martha's house, what she called the parents' house, and Dole's studio, which was originally a goat shed. Um, and on a humid day, you can still tell it was a goat shed. Um, so they were all adobe, traditional adobe structures, and that was part of the problem. They were crumbling. The roofs had not been replaced. In fact, when the roof started leaking, what they did was just pile more dirt on top of the roofs, and so they became incredibly heavy, and the structure was suffering as a result. All the vigas inside the house were bowed. They looked like an old horse's back. Um, they were one wall of the parents' house was actually in danger of collapsing and falling downhill. One the north wall of Dole's studio was crumbling also, so we had to replace those walls, replace the roofs, and do a lot of structural renovation. Nothing, of course, was up to code. The electricity in Dole's studio was provided by um, several extension cords that were joined together and plugged in to an outlet in Martha's kitchen. Um, and so things like that. The septic tank was not functioning. It was also located below, actually above hill from the well, which was not a great design. So we had to put in a new septic system, and I ended up drilling a new well at the very northern uphill boundary of the property. Um, so we had to do a lot of work, a lot of structural work, and it took a couple of years just to get things up to code and structurally sound. Um, and so, yes,
Um, I don't think I have a clear understanding of sort of like I know Martha had been living in her house, but no one had been living in her parents' house since they died in the 80s.
no, that's not true. She actually she had guests who stayed there, but she also rented um, to people uh, for various periods of time. Um, but she was a very strict landlord, and I met people who actually had wanted to rent it, but one of the stipulations was that you could not move a single piece of furniture. So it made it kind of difficult on would-be renters. Um, Martha was very particular about the interior of the parents' house, keeping it exactly the way it was when her parents died, and particularly Dole's studio. Everything in Dole's, it was like King Tut's tomb. Everything in Dole's studio was exactly in situ as it was the day he died, down to his glasses and the last note he took by the telephone. Um, and so it was kind of a sacred space to Martha. And when we renovated the studio, um, the front part of the studio was kind of the tomb part. The back part of the studio was just a storeroom, and I converted that into a modern art, small modern art studio with its own printing press and other equipment and that kind of thing. And that has been used now by faculty, by visiting artists and by art faculty. The front part of the studio, Bruce Crowder and his then wife and I meticulously documented where everything was in place because we had to remove it to have the roof replaced and that one wall replaced. And then after the renovations, we put everything back where it was. We had photographs and we had notes, telling us exactly where everything had to be replaced. One piece of furniture, which was a cabinet at the front, was completely damaged when that front wall began collapsing, and um, the brother of one of the members of our board of directors, Judy Baker, and her brother grew up next door to the Reeds in Stillwater. And her brother, um, Bob Donaldson, had Martha was actually his babysitter when when she was still living in Martha grew up. She was born in Cincinnati, but she grew up in Stillwater, and was very proud of the fact that she grew up in Stillwater and went to Stillwater High and then to what was then Oklahoma A&M. So she was his babysitter for a number of years, and he was somebody who's very much into woodworking. So he and his wife came out in the summertime and rebuilt that whole bit of furniture. And then he also built a bench, which is on the property as well. Um, so that was that's sort of the history of the renovation of the studio.
What what how did you all decide that you were going to put everything back? Like why was that important?
Well, because in everything that we did on the property, we tried to balance making it functional and legal, um, and up to code, and also, but with the idea of preserving as much of its history as we possibly could. Um, and that was part of it. Martha actually stipulated that she did not want that part of the studio disturbed, that it needed to be kept the way it was in kind of in perpetuity. So we were just kind of following her wishes as we did and with some other of the renovations on the property.
So that was part of like the written agreement for
No,
the.
I don't think it was part of the written agreement, but it was something that she had made known. Little things like the fact that there's a cholla cactus next to the steps on the front door of her house. And people over the years have wanted us to chop that down. Um, and she planted it, she told me she planted it by herself with her own hands. And, I felt that it should stay there. I mean, it was something that she wanted to be there. And so, as far as I know, it's still there.
um that makes sense. That's also a very helpful visual. So with the work that had to be done on the structures, um was there anything else that she had sort of said that she hoped would stay the same, or was there a vision that you know about that she kind of like hoped would happen with
Well, we
this
tried,
space?
we knew that from, what I told you about the way she interacted with potential renters, we knew that she wanted to keep the parents' house, as intact as possible. We changed the use of some of the rooms. We, made them more functional. We cut a new doorway and we added another whole wing with another bedroom and another bath and a physical plant because it had nothing really functional in terms of heating and cooling or any of that. Um, there's also at the back one of the reason that the main reason that the south wall of the parents' house, which is right on the edge of a very steep slope, um, was crumbling, is that Doel had started a patio back there, a brick patio, and it had a raised border around it, and he never finished it. And it's where the only canale from the roof drained. And so that became effectively a pool particularly when there was snow melt. And traditional adobe is very porous. These houses, our first builder, contractor, Wayne Rutherford, said that he thought, and he's the head of the local history society and things like that, member of the board of the Kit Carson Museum, and so he's studied local history and architecture. And he thought that part of the parents' house had probably been begun in the 1840s. So it's a fairly old structure, traditional adobe, which means no foundation. The bricks just sit on river rock. Um, and so adobe's porous, so it began absorbing all that moisture and crumbling and disintegrating. And so I had to, fairly early on, I asked Burns and Nigel Jones, the university architect, if um, we could hire a local architect as a consultant. You're getting very fuzzy suddenly. Um, can you still see me okay? Ah, okay. Um, Uh, and so I went ahead and hired a local architect, Beverly Spears, here in Santa Fe, who is actually an expert on traditional adobe and has published several books on um, houses in northern New Mexico and churches in Mexico and things like that. And so she um, recommended that we hire a man from Santa Fe who was an expert on foundations, and they actually drilled what they call helical piers, which are just big screws into the earth, and now the foundation of that house rests on those, so it's supported much better than it was. It made me think of the things that they do in Venice and places like that, to try and preserve buildings. Um, so, I learned a lot about adobe construction, about radon abatement, about septic tanks, about water rights. I had to go to the state engineer's office and research our water rights before we drilled the new well. So it was very kind of multifaceted project, and that was just the renovation part of it. Then of course there was the special events and the educational programming, which had to
So
be developed.
yeah, I do want to talk about that next, but I'm curious if you knew what all the work was going to be involved from that side of things when you said yes.
Nobody did. Nobody knew what was going to be involved until we started. It was one of those projects that when you get into an old house, you really don't know until you start, ripping stuff up. And there were all kinds of things. Martha had at one point over 100 cats. Um, and so the floor of her house had to be ripped up because of the odor. And we had to redo the joists, remove the dirt underneath the joists, replace it with a mylar shield, a mylar layer to keep out the odor, and then put in new dirt and new joists and new oak flooring. So things like that, and you just didn't discover until you started going in what needed to be done. How the plumbing had to be ripped up, all the electrical had to be replaced. Um, things had to be done for radon abatement. Um, there's a big radon problem in Taos because of the rocks, the geology up there. So yeah, nobody knew, and certainly, Burns has often said that if he'd known what it cost, he, he wouldn't have agreed to it from the outset. He said, if somebody tries to sell you an old adobe building, don't take them up on it.
Don't do it.
So nobody knew.
Yeah. Well, and after kind of starting to dig into it, were you still happy that you said yes?
Oh
Or
yeah,
did you?
it was really interesting. I mean, I learned so much about things. I learned a whole lot about the history. I got to know people in Taos. Um, the people who were involved, who were in charge of the, acequia system there. I don't know if you're familiar with acequias, but it's acequias were actually brought by this. The whole idea of an acequia system is brought by the Spanish. It actually comes from the Moors and from the Arabic al Sakaya, which means waterway, and that becomes acequia in Spanish. And so the way the acequia system works is there is off of a river or stream, there's a main acequia, which is always called the acequia madre. And if you go to towns, and there's an acequia madre here in Santa Fe as well as in Taos, and then there are subsidiary acequias that run off of that and then into communities, and it's a communal waterway, so that you have to belong to the acequia association, and that usually means that your family has to have lived in the area for about 200 years. Um, and then once a month, you are allowed to shunt water from the local acequia branch and flood your property. So if you have an orchard, for instance, or fields, you're allowed to use that water for a couple hours, and then you have to shunt it off. Georgia O'Keeffe had an acequia access in her house, and her garden was watered uh, from the acequia. Um, yeah. I got to learn all about that and meet the people who are in charge. One of them, the person who was actually the head of the association then, was she was a Martinez. She was the baker at the Mabel Dodge Lujan house, but she was a direct descendant of Padre Martinez, um, whose hacienda is a big tourist attraction in Taos, and who is actually was a tremendous hero in Taos in the 19th century. Um, was excommunicated by Archbishop Lamy because he didn't believe in the doctrine of celibacy, and is one of the big villains of Willa Cather's Death Comes for the Archbishop. but he's a hero in Taos, and there's a statue of him on the plaza.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, that fascinated me. Just becoming involved in the history fascinated me. And then I really got interested in, I worked very closely with both Nigel and Beverly and her staff in redesigning these buildings. So I became, a lot of my ideas ended up getting incorporated in the renovations of the buildings. And so that was really fun. It was, a creative outlet.
Yeah. Um, well, I'm glad it felt like that instead of
Yeah,
a
yeah.
complete opposite of what you.
Times when I doubted whether it was ever going to happen, whether everything would ever be completed, because we had to pause. We did it in stages, and that was because we had to raise money, and keep raising more and more money, and wait for an annual allocation from the university and that kind of thing. So there was always a question of whether we were going to have enough funding to finish the project. Um, so that was, it was doubtful, and just we kept discovering new things that had to be done, and
Yeah.
that increased the cost. But thankfully, we had wonderful donors. Jim Valiant basically funded the renovation of Martha's house, um, and his daughter donated all of the furnishings, um, things like that. The Coopers um, donated $250,000 toward the renovation of the parents' house, which is now Casa Cooper. The Parkers donated a large sum of money for the renovation of the studio, um, Jim and Linda Parker in Albuquerque. That was the other great thing about this, is I really got to know a lot of people, a lot of OSU alums who I would not have met otherwise, and we've remained friends with some of them over the years. Um, and so, that was, me getting to meet interesting people, and people who live in Taos year round, or summer in Taos, or live in Albuquerque, or live in Santa Fe. So, that was a great benefit of the job.
Yeah. I
And
can
then
see that.
as I developed educate the educational programs, I got to meet a lot of OSU faculty, from departments that you know the English department didn't regularly interact with, um, and so that was a great benefit too. Um, and I think it was 2012. Uh, a Mary Rupert Stoyescu, who was in what was then the College of Human Environmental Sciences. That college just changed its names many times, and they changed the dinnerware whenever they changed the name. But 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 she came out and helped me go through. Um, Martha had left a tremendous amount of clothing. Some of it was in the studio, but a lot of it was outside in the wooden well house, um, and where it was kind of exposed, almost exposed to the elements, exposed to rodents, et cetera, et cetera. So Mary came out, and we spent several days going through Martha's clothing and deciding what should be kept and preserved, what was iconic. We also went through papers, and we discovered patterns that Martha had drawn, and things like that. And so Mary took back a number of those garments to her college, and I think they're still in storage there somewhere. And at one point, I think she curated a show on campus of Martha's creations also. I'm pretty sure she did. And in fact, people lent uh, dresses and outfits for that exhibit, because there are a lot of OSU alumna who actually own Martha of Taos creations. Um, Martha of Taos's shop was on the Paseo del Pueblo Norte, which is the north part of the Paseo, proceeding north from uh, the plaza area. Um, and her shop was right next door to the old Taos Inn. Um, they are kind of right in the center of town. And So everyone knew Martha. I I tried for years, and I think people at OSU should still try to see if some kind of plaque can be put up there. I mean, there's a plaque across the street on the building that used to be J.C. Penney's, saying that this used to be J.C. Penney's, but there's no plaque for Martha of Taos. Uh, and I heard great stories about Martha and her shop. And Martha was people in town would call supposedly, and again, I don't know how many of these are just anecdotal, but apparently people would call each other when Martha was sighted on the roads, on the streets, and driving her car. And so that they could wait a while before they drove themselves. Um, one woman who had been, I think the manager of the old house inn told me that Martha liked to park her car. It's a very, very narrow street, and it's a tremendous bottleneck in the summertime, particularly. Martha liked to park her car kind of half on the sidewalk and half off, so she was kind of blocking part of that very narrow main street, and go into the bar at the old house and have cocktails. And so the story I heard from this woman was that one day she was blocking traffic that way, and a policeman came in and asked her if it was her car, and she said it was. And he said, "Well, you need to move that." And she said, "I'll move it when I'm done drinking." Martha was very self-assertive.
Mhm.
She liked to have what she called soirees with hooch at her house, and it was very well known for her parties that went on into the wee hours of the morning. And I was informed that most of the guests were younger men. Um, Martha never Martha never married because she promised Doel that she wouldn't marry, so that she would take care of him in his old age. But she was not celibate.
Yeah. She seems to definitely have cultivated a very strong persona of herself.
Oh yeah, well, people up in Taos kind of think of her as being, in the same class as Mabel Dodge, and people like that. Millicent Rogers, the grand dames of Taos society.
So, do a lot of people still remember her,
Oh
like
yeah,
in town?
oh yeah, yeah. And as I said, a number of people still have her creations. Um, my wife has a Fiesta dress that she inherited from her mother. That's a Martha of Taos. Uh,
Interesting.
so, and she kind of regularized what became the sort of canonical Fiesta wear look, which is the Navajo uh, black velvet top with inlaid silver work and what called the broomstick skirts, the pleated broomstick skirt. And that was the look that she kind of cultivated. And it became the uniforms for a time for the docents at the Millicent Rogers Museum and places like that.
Yeah. Well, it's very iconic. I mean, it's still, sort of in a period of time iconic too.
Oh yeah, yeah,
Yeah. Um, well, so let's talk a little bit about the educational. So, like you were asked to take on this role with an idea of like I'm going to be creating this space to do
right.
this engagement, and then you realize, well, I've got to get the place help get the place stabilized first, right?
Right.
So how did you sort of develop like what this is going to look like? You said there's very little direction when you came in, so
Uh-huh. Well, we wanted to, again, certain parts of it preserved so that they had the same look and feel to some extent, but also to make them functional. So I wanted to have a space in both what was Martha's house, which is now Casa Sutherland, and the parents' house, which is now Casa Cooper, have space where you could have students meeting, have seminars, and that kind of thing. And so we, a kind of informal classroom space. And we have two rooms in one in Martha's house and one in the parents' house that function in that way. We've also used all of Martha's house for the scholar development program at Oklahoma State has for many years brought the students who are writing essays, drafting their essays for major scholarships like the Gates and the Rhodes and those the Udall. They come out and during winter break and spend several days on the property brainstorming and drafting their essays. And I think that's been very successful. They tend to respond to it's an atmosphere that kind of really fires one's creative imagination. And particularly students from, one of the great things about it is that it's our summer programs became for OSU students the equivalent of study abroad. I had students who had never been outside of Oklahoma, had never been in an airplane, um, and it is so different, so geographically and culturally different from Oklahoma that it really is an eye opener for students from Oklahoma. And it has that same effect as study abroad would have, but it's affordable. Very often students would just carpool together. 4 or 5 of them get in somebody's car and drive out to Taos for the summer class. Um, and the other thing, of course, is that we had rambling, but again, we had a number of really generous people donate endowments for scholarships. So the students, their study is heavily subsidized in the summertime. We also got generous endowments for a visiting scholar program and a visiting artist program. Those are two things that I established early on. Um,
Regarding the student scholarship, was that something that was always originally planned, or did that develop out of situational need, or how did that come about?
well, I think it's something that Sally started, um, you know, subsidizing those workshops and internships for art students. But then it became expanded, and there were just very often, people on the board would just come to us and say, I want to endow a scholarship, and this is what I want it to be for. Whether I wanted it for for specific for art classes, or I wanted it to be just a general scholarship for any student for any class. So very often we were actually approached by who people who would donate money in the names of their parents, for instance, and
Yeah,
things like that.
yeah.
So really, really a lot of generous OSU alums who contributed money for that.
And that doesn't surprise me at all, right? Like um, that doesn't. I'm wondering though about whenever the first early classes with students, was it hard to recruit students to come? Were there barriers to participation of any kind?
Yeah, I think it took a while before, the art people, had already established that they were going to be doing these programs in the summer, and art students knew about it. But elsewhere on campus, it took a little bit of advertising and um, talking to faculty and meeting with faculty to tell them what we were doing and that kind of thing. Um, and then it kind of, you know, snowballed after that when people would come back to campus and tell their colleagues about their experiences, and students come back to campus. Then of course it started to snowball after that. But yeah, it took a little bit of time to get it started. But that first summer I can't remember, but I think I had 12 students. I taught a class called New Mexico Modernism, which is art and literature in the period between World War I and World War II in uh, Taos and Santa Fe. And that went well. And we had both graduate students and undergraduates taking that class. It was an English class, English and American Studies credit. Um, and so, and the American Studies program, by the way, helped a lot to popularize our classes and our programs. Um, so I was an adjunct member, a member of American Studies. Um, and so that helped a great deal. Uh, but
What were some of the ways that you made those connections with what you were trying to do in the American Studies program?
well, I my doctorate was to some extent an American Studies degree. I focused on modern American literature to some extent, and even when I was an undergraduate, the Yale American Studies program was one of the first. I think it started up right after World War II. Um, Actually, it was subsidized by the government as an anti-communist program. But that yeah, the the government also funded, and artists did not know this, but they funded abstract expressionist art as the antithesis of Soviet realism.
Did not know that.
So the same artists who were left wing, most of them, were on the one hand being funded by the CIA and investigated by the FBI.
Mhm. Mhm. Oh, I can totally see that.
Yeah. So the classes that I taught were, art and literature in the context of the culture and history of northern New Mexico. And so it was kind of American Studies.
Yeah. So, how did you make the decision on what sort of things to focus on for courses at the Doel Reed Center?
we I made it open. Anything that anybody from any department could devise that somehow had to be taught. The one stipulation was there had to be a reason to teach it in Taos. So a film class that in which students just sat around and watched westerns, right, was not going to fly. It had to, and we had a board of people who were involved in the selection process, also faculty members. Um, but it had to, somehow require that the students be in and experience the environment. So, all kinds of, geology classes, art classes, um, you know, you name it. Um, just about almost every college, I think, on campus.
What were some of the more popular courses, do you remember, while you were?
I think they were all fairly popular, but we had to have a limit because we didn't have the facilities to have more than 10 or 12 students in a class. So it wasn't like we could have a large lecture class. Plus, one of the other requirements was that students had to go out on excursions, um, and so you don't want to have to herd more than 10 or 12 students. Um, Particularly if you're in the Rio Grande Gorge or, in the forest or uh, going down into kivas, um, you know, deserted 2,000-year-old kivas. Kivas are underground structures that were ceremonial structures. Um, we had to rescue one art class because they borrowed our ladder and no one apparently knew how to work an extension ladder. And so they put it into the kiva upside down and then it came apart while some of the students were in the kiva. And, and so I got a call. Had to arrange for a rescue of art students. So you never knew what was going to happen, and so it had to be a manageable class size for that reason.
So were you doing sort of um, the leisure courses that whole time as well, or did that come at a
No,
different?
that kind of developed later, and it actually developed after I stepped down.
Oh,
You know,
okay.
well, we did offer continuing ed courses, but they weren't leisure learning courses. They were regular classes. So I offered that New Mexico modernism class as a short continuing ed class for OSU alums, and Burns and Ann actually took it the first time I offered it. And the other interesting person who took it was the supermodel Lauren Hutton, who
Really?
was probably the first real supermodel, right? With the canonical gap in her front teeth.
Is she? Does she live in Taos?
Yeah, part of the year. Part I don't know now, but when she was in my class, she was part of the year in Taos, part of the year in Paris with Eric Idle, um, and she was really good friends with Eric Idle and Angelica Houston. Um, So I got a call from her manager, her personal assistant, saying, Miss Hutton will be taking your class. She's in Mexico swimming with whales right now, but we'll be taking your class. And she was a really serious student. Um, she did all of the reading, and was very, very much engaged in conversation, and had a lot to say about the works and the artwork. Um, and she was very fascinated by. We met part of the time in the La Fonda on the plaza in Taos. There were paintings, erotic paintings by D.H. Lawrence, which ended up in Taos because they were banned from England as being pornographic. And so they're in there behind a curtain, and people get to see them when they ask, and I think they do them on tours. But we were in that room, and so we could pull aside the curtain and look at these paintings, and she was very fascinated by those. So, yeah, and so I actually had a barbecue for the class. At the end of the class, I did one of the things we read was Willa Cather's Death Comes to the Archbishop, and I did a little tour of places in Santa Fe that were walking tour that were in the book, and then we had a barbecue at my house, which our house then was a couple blocks from the plaza, um, and so she came to that, and um, my wife's family then owned a tequila company, and she took a bottle of our tequila to Paris the next morning to give to Eric. Um,
That's surreal.
Taos is like that. One of the things about Lauren is though she used to ride motorcycles with Dennis Hopper, and they got into a really bad wreck and had to be airlifted from Taos to Albuquerque, and suffered. I'm pretty sure it had to brain damage, but pretty sure it had to be temporal lobe damage because I know other people who have had that. And one of the things that results from that is that you lose your ability to filter. So pretty much anything that you think tends to come out of your mouth. And so she was a lot like that. But she was great. She was, a really good sport. And of course,
That's
everywhere we went, there had to be a photo op. There was a great taco stand north of town that Burns, told us about. We went there. They had to have their picture taken. The cops who were eating there had to have their picture taken. You know.
that is interesting. Was that your only celebrity experience teaching courses there?
Yeah, yeah.
I
That
mean,
was
not that that's not enough.
yeah.
It just seems like there might be more. You never
Yeah,
know.
yeah, that was the main one. Um,
Interesting.
yeah, and fairly recently she was on the cover of Vogue again. She made a big comeback. I think it was as recent as 2 years ago
I'll have
or
to
a
look
year
it up.
ago. She was on the cover of Vogue again. So,
So,
um, so yeah, I taught that class, and then I taught a follow up class, which was um, art in the period after World War II, art and so it was the Taos Moderns and then more contemporary Native American and you know, Hispanic literature. And that went quite well. That was in a course that I taught for, OSU alums and the Hargises. And, and then I also taught a class called The Nuclear Bomb and the Land of Enchantment, which was a very popular class. So
Yeah.
those do well. And
Yeah.
we've got, we've expanded them. Carol has expanded them so they do things like trout fishing and printmaking and her courses on New Mexico cuisine and things like that.
Yeah. I've seen those too. Yeah. Um, well, so I guess thinking
I have
through
to say
that,
that the initial impulse for devising continuing ed classes was very mercenary. I thought, how can we get more alums involved and interested in contributing to the center?
yeah. I mean, I think that's an important space to be able to reflect on because, you know, that's part of what I've been sort of trying to get at is like there's the sort of visionary thing, but then there's the practical how do things
Right,
actually and a lot of that is where's the pressure and where are you trying to, like build capacity and build interest and
right.
support and
And things
that's
like,
a good way.
and things like keeping costs down, right? So, you know, the old, oh, I just lost you. Okay, so what I was saying was one of the things that I tried to keep in mind was future maintenance costs, right? And because it's expensive to maintain that property, and so things like our our alums really wanted it to be landscaped. Um, and one of the reasons I hired Beverly Spears is that she's a landscape architect as well, and was actually one of the people who designed the local botanical gardens here in Santa Fe, and knows everything about you know local plants and what takes the least amount of water but looks nice. So they wanted the Valiants wanted two formal gardens, and they paid for those, but they have to be maintained. And people wanted they wanted grass, so we put in buffalo grass and things like that. But I decided that we absolutely had to have a functional well for that reason. And so the initial outlay for the well, I think, has probably already paid for itself, um, and water. And you can't. We couldn't have had the landscaping that we have otherwise, because it would have been way too expensive to use, water from the Talpa water district. And in fact, in the city limits of Taos, it's against the law to use water for landscaping. Um, so things like that. Um, we put uh, all of our utilities underground, so that would, because they're high. That it's on a steep hillside. There are high winds, things like that. Costs of replacing things. So we try to project out and figure out what we could afford and how we could arrive at that figure for maintenance.
How many months out of the year or how many weeks out of the year do you think it's an occupied space?
Well, Carol would be able to tell you that more than I would, but I think, pretty. She tries to have it used pretty much year round. She started doing, having faculty who are on sabbatical or taking leave or doing research use the facility and actually live in one of the houses. So that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And it's used in the summertime. She does leisure learning in October as well. So there's the effort to pretty much have somebody there, and there's a good security rationale for that as well. I mean, it's in a very isolated place, and it's the strip of road that runs along the front. The the which is actually part of the Camino Real. Um, the Camino Real actually starts in Mexico City and ends at the Martinez Hacienda in Taos. Um, and so that's part of that runs right past the property. And
Yeah.
but there's a lot of foot traffic and you know, people passing by, and so it helps to have people there a lot of the time,
Yeah.
just to keep an eye on things.
When you were with the Doel Reed Center, it sounds like you lived in Taos.
No, I spent I stayed up there. You know, some in the summertime I spent a month up there, um, but I commuted a lot of most of the time.
Oh, okay. You just mentioned that you had a house that you hosted your barbecue at. So I,
Yeah, no, here in town in Santa Fe, because I did the Santa Fe walking tour at the end of my class of Death Comes to the Archbishop. So it was at my house here in Santa Fe.
I'm
Um,
sorry I missed that part.
and that was, you know, because Lauren was,
Yeah.
you know, getting ready to go to the airport the next morning in Albuquerque to fly to Paris.
Okay.
But
Yeah.
yeah, no, it was here. But I commuted, and it's an incredible drive. Once you get from Espanola, you're driving through the gorge and then up the hill, and then you have a spectacular view from above of the Rio Grande Gorge. So it's a really wonderful drive.
Yeah.
And it, the way I drive, it took about an hour, 10 hour and 15 minutes each way. So it's
Yeah.
just kind of a regular commute.
Well, so there was you were the first programming director, or you were the second official director, but you were the first director after Martha passed. Is that correct?
Well, you know,
I know it's squishy. It's not.
yeah, well, Sally was still director for the spring after Martha passed.
Okay, so for
From
the
the
first
night,
couple of months.
yeah.
Okay.
And so Sally, in terms of programming, Sally, was actually in charge when my summer class was first approved, and Angie's class. But after that, the programming um, was pretty much what I was responsible for, and the visiting scholar and the visiting artist and that kind of thing as well. And one of the stipulations, too, of those was that the visiting scholar and visiting artist both had to give presentations in Taos and on campus in Stillwater.
At OSU.
Yeah. And in fact, there was one, Scott Momaday's daughter was supposed to give a presentation today, I think, but it was canceled or postponed for some reason.
Yeah, that's
Interestingly
nice.
enough, my wife knows her quite well because she was my wife's student here when my wife taught in the
Oh,
public schools in Santa Fe back in the 70s. So,
it's really interesting.
and Scott Momaday actually came to my wife's English class and talked to the students. So,
That might be terrifying, but awesome. But awesome. Um, well, so over the course of your time directing the programs there, um, what were you say? What would be some of the changes that you sort of saw, or what were some of the, some of the important momentum that you feel like you were able to contribute to?
well, I think, one thing in terms of the programming, I think, kind of word of mouth, and the fact that, we started to get more and more applications from one year. I got because I began advertising in art journals, I got over 150 applications for our visiting artist residency from all over the world,
Wow.
from the Middle East, from the Philippines, from China, from Japan. Um, so that the word got out, and then that program really got a lot of momentum, um, and and we had some really great visiting artists who contributed a lot to things. One of the early ones, Scott Colbo, was our visiting artist when the studio had been finished. Um, I had I asked two members of the art faculty, Chris Ramsey and Mark Sisson, who's a printmaker, to come out and look at that space in the back of the studio and tell me what kinds of equipment I should and furnishings I should order and recommend a modern press and things like that. So they came out and helped with that greatly, and helped me design it and helped me choose the equipment. And so my wife and I, we bought it and we rented a truck. We bought it here in Santa Fe, some of it, and rented a truck, and we had the printing press, which was made in Albuquerque, in my garage for several months while the studio was being renovated. And then the two of us drove up to Taos, and with Mike Mattis, who was our caretaker and had been the foreman of the construction uh, crew, helped us lift everything and put everything in the studio. But then Scott came as a visiting artist, and he really set it up for printmaking. And he went in and cleaned and adjusted Doel's original press, which Doel's press is unique. The bed is not any standard size. It was made by OSU engineering students from old oil well parts. Um,
Cool.
and so it is unique and it's still functional. And Scott got it working again and started printing aquatints off of it. So, the visiting artists have contributed in their own ways to the programming. But that program really took off once we started advertising. And it made a huge difference.
Yeah, I could see that.
And the other thing was getting known in Taos, which took a while. And there's still a lot of people in Taos who don't know that the Doel Reed Center exists. So, I went to the chamber and I went to speak before the Rotary Club and things like that. We had brochures made up and put, so they're in, when you drive to Taos and you go to the information booth place, there were, flyers about the center, things like that, just to try and get people in town aware of the fact that we existed. Um,
Yeah.
that took some time. But we had a partnership with the Taos Art Museum, the Nikolai Feshin House. Again, that was kind of via Burns, who was on the board of that museum. And so we had a partnership with them, and that helped a lot. And there have been exhibits in that museum, Doel Reed exhibits, things like that. Uh,
What is the importance of having a lot of inserting the Doel Reed Center within the Taos community? Like, if it's an OSU extension space, like, why is it important to be embedded within the Taos?
Well, I think one of our goals early on, and certainly since Carol's taken over, one of the goals of the center is to really give something back to that community, to become a functioning part of the community. So she started doing things with public schools, and so she's hosted art workshops for students in the public schools and things like that. So I just we want it to not be a foreign body, and people in northern New Mexico are very aware of and limited to a limited degree tolerant of invaders, and there's a long history of invasion, and there's still an independence movement in northern New Mexico, um, independence of the United States from the United States, and either an independent nation or return to Mexico. And there's even a history of violence in northern New Mexico. There's a famous incident when Reyes Tijerina and his followers took over the courthouse in Tierra Amarilla, and there was a big, they were armed. There was a big standoff. It's kind of like the an analog of Wounded Knee, that kind of thing. Um, and so there's we wanted to not be like, Dennis Hopper, for instance, came in and tried to take over Taos, and people still remember that. And so, it was really important, I think, for the community to feel like we were contributing something to the community, that we
Yeah.
were not just feeding on it the way so many people have in the past.
I think that's interesting because so far you're the person to articulate that the best, in sort of how this space, because I think that like from the surface it's like, this space that is like OSU ceded territory
Right,
in town,
exactly.
when it's really not that, but that takes work,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah. And it helps that people knew Dole and Martha, right? And that they were a part of the community for so many years. And, that Dole had relationships with, many of the famous artists and lived. In fact, that piece of that stretch that the Doel Reed Center is on is known as Artist Ridge because there are so many artist studios there.
Yeah.
And so, but I think that's something that the Hargises felt was really important too from the very beginning is that the center gives something back to the community
um
because
was
they
there Go ahead.
they 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 summered in Taos regularly. And,
Before this.
oh yeah,
Okay.
and so and there's a long tradition actually of OSU faculty um, summering in Taos and Santa Fe,
Interesting.
going back to that's how Dole ended up there, um, and he used to go to Paris, but then World War II happened, and he started going to Taos, and his students started going to Taos, and so. There's a long. It's funny. There's a kind of OSU Taos pipeline that has existed for many decades. So it's not just kind of by accident that the center is there.
Yeah, I didn't know that. That's interesting.
Now, there were people in the English department who owned second homes in northern New Mexico, in
Yeah.
Red River, places like that.
Yeah. um well, then I do have another question related to that, but I think you just kind of answered it, but I'm going to check anyway. So do you think that there was any resentment or any frustration within the Taos community that property, that space didn't go to an entity in Taos?
No,
No.
I don't think so. And it's funny. There's this. Taos is a strange place in that it really has not taken advantage of some of the things that it has. Um, that it there are a lot of people in Taos, some of them, my age, former hippies, um, who want Taos to stay the way it was in the 60s, who want to keep it a small town that's off the beaten path that nobody really knows about. And there's a real strong sentiment, that, in support of that. And so, for instance, there's a marvelous building on the plaza, which is um, you can get access to it now, but when I first started working on the center, you could not. It's what was the jail, and the old jail cells are there from the 19th century, and the sheriff's office, and above it, this marvelous courthouse that has like 40-foot ceilings and incredible murals that were actually frescoes, genuine frescoes that were done by a couple of the local artists, but also people who worked with Diego Rivera in Mexico.
Yeah.
And they're done in the 30s. It was a WPA project, and this is just an amazing space. But the city didn't take care of it or publicize it, really. And there are things like that. So it's not like people resented that space because there are a lot of spaces that aren't being used still. And it's a very poor community. Northern New Mexico did not recover from the last recession or depression at all. And you can see that if you just drive through some of the small communities.
Do you mean the 2009?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Do we have choices when we talk about?
I'm talking about the big one. I'm talking about the bail out the banks.
Yeah, the 2008,
Yeah.
2009. Yeah.
And there are a lot of empty galleries on the Paseo. Um, I became friends with um, an artist who had a printmaker artist who had a gallery and his studio right across the street from the Taos Art Museum, because initially we had classes in the Taos Art Museum, um, and in Nikolai Feshin's studio, which is incredible. But he became very supportive of the center and actually would let our art students put on an exhibit in his gallery and use his press and do things like that. But he ended up having to close his gallery, and he also had a gallery in um, Colorado Springs, and he just retreated to Colorado Springs for that reason. It was really too bad. He was a great person, and he had the secret spots for foraging porcini mushrooms up in the mountains, and
Mhm.
so he was my supplier of fresh and dried porcini mushrooms. But he wouldn't tell you where they were either.
Yep.
Secret grove. But the other thing is we started doing uh, housing our students and having classes at the Sagebrush Inn, and that came about because the woman who was then in charge of their special programs and special events was an OSU alumna who, when we had our first dedication ceremony, came up to me and said, "Look, I can give you guys great rates for rooms and for classroom space." And so that's how we got involved with the Sagebrush Inn, which is not all that far from the Doel Reed Center. So there are all kinds of OSU Taos connections um, that came into play.
Yeah, that's interesting. Um, well, I think the only thing I have left that I would like for you to talk about, I'm sure there may be other things that you want to make sure we talk about, but the only other thing I wanted to bring up was it was just sort of like, you left in 2015
Right,
formally, right?
right.
And so what are your sort of like visions for the future? What do you hope if like all the things just keep growing the way they're growing, what do you sort of hope your vision for it is?
Well, I just hope it survives. I don't.
Yeah.
From things I've heard, the current administration is not as supportive um, of, and I can say this because I'm not involved with OSU anymore. You don't have to nod or shake your head no. That the current administration is really not nearly as supportive of the arts as the Hargises were in general. And so I'm worried about that, and I think other people are worried about that will dry up um, in the near future. And so
Yeah.
that's a big concern. So first of all, I would just like to see it survive, and the programming that we have, continue to be funded. Um, that's a major concern.
Yeah. Well, that's a lot different level of like it's realistic visioning.
Yeah.
If it had no barriers, like if it had an endowment to support itself and funding to grow as it needed to, what do you think?
Well, there are things that at one point there's a convention center downtown that was that the city put up for sale. And so at one point, if we'd had the funding to do it, we could have bought that space or part of that space and had actual classrooms, had an actual large lecture space and things like that. It ended up getting bought out in part, at least, by a charter school, I think. But I was actually approached and asked if we were interested in buying that space. And we actually looked, I talked to the Burns about it, and we actually looked into what it would cost and whether or not that was something that could be done. But, that kind of expansion would really take it to a whole nother level. And the other thing is that I wanted to see happen that never happened. Um, there's a UNM branch, UNM Taos, that is just an island that Albuquerque, the main campus, doesn't even know exists and doesn't fund and is not really interested in, and which is really, as a UNM alum, I think that's a huge mistake. Um, UNM actually pulled out of Santa Fe too, and it's the opposite of what's happened with Oklahoma State, expanding all over the state, right? And yeah, and so that I wanted, and I actually went and talked with the dean down in Albuquerque and with the people up in UNM Taos about partnering with them and offering regular classes, um, because they don't have they have the facilities, but they don't have the faculty to offer graduate classes, for instance. We have the faculty, but we didn't have the facilities. And so I was exploring the possibility of partnering with them. Um, and at one point, I was discussing co-offering a graduate class with a faculty member I know down there. And it didn't. It worked out from our end, but not from their end. They couldn't get funding for their students. But we actually had devised a graduate class that we were going to offer together in the summer in Taos. That would have been both OSU and UNM credit.
Wow.
So things like that, would be possible, I think, in the future if it expanded.
Yeah, that's interesting. Um,
And then I think, being able to do, if we had facilities like that, if we had access to the UNM campus, for instance, has a jewelry making lab that they don't use, and we were talking about partnering with them. And Chris Ramsey was going to offer a regular class and have our students and their students use that space. Um, and, so if we had access to, the facilities are very limited. If we had access to greater facilities, we could expand the visiting artist program. We could expand programs for our own faculty. Faculty could spend a whole sabbatical up there and have the facilities to do whatever they needed to do. So, you know, that's one of the things that I think um, Carol and I both tried to emphasize was that it should be a resource not only for students but also for faculty,
yeah,
and be a really important resource in terms of faculty development, and particularly for faculty who are untenured, and have projects that are in some way related to the region. So Liz Roth, who did the whole Grand Canyon thing, she did a lot of work up there, um, you know, because it's the landscape that she paints. Um,
yeah.
and it's like, Doel became fascinated. He said he painted everything he could think of in Oklahoma, painted or printed,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
there was nothing left.
Oh, come on. Well, I do think it is one of those things that we are. OSU has a lot of Western scholars too, so that makes sense,
Right,
right? We have a
absolutely,
Western
absolutely.
history and Western literature and
Yeah.
Western art, and so it's not, as you have been saying, it's not like a false reach.
Yeah. And actually, I was invited to give a talk on the center and on the Reeds at the museum, at the Cowboy and Western Museum in Oklahoma City. So
Yeah. All right. That's definitely what I knew to ask you about, or had sort of thought through. Was there anything else that you think that we need to talk about that we didn't cover?
no, not really. I mean, something that we did that this project did again was employ a lot of local people at a time when there wasn't a lot of construction going on. So I mean, we banked a lot of good karma for that, and I did things like the foreman uh, of we had two contractors, Wayne Rutherford, who does large scale projects, and it's kind of he does school buildings and um, businesses and things like that. And he did the renovation part. And then I decided that even though it was not required by law, apparently, if you OSU is not allowed by law to own property in another state. So the Doel Reed Center is not owned by Oklahoma State University; it's owned by the foundation, right? So because of that, we did not have to put up things to bid, but I decided that we should. So after Wayne finished the renovation, when we were going to move on, the demolition, when we were going to move on to the renovation, I put it up. I used Spears and we put it up to bid, and we ended up choosing somebody who was more of a domestic contractor and also was the lowest bid. And that ended up being a great choice. And it was his foreman, Mike Mares, who lives about a mile and a half. You can actually see his house from the Doel Reed Center. And so he spent a lot of time on the property just on his own, checking up on things and things like that. And so I decided to, when he stopped working, I decided to make him our caretaker. And that was really good because he was very much plugged into the local Hispanic community. His family had been there forever. And we hired a lot of, locals. And when we were renovating the parents' house, there was a lot of furniture that was not of any historical value. And I just let the workmen, we had a lunch break, and the workmen invited their wives, and they came and picked what they wanted, and they took it home.
Yeah.
Because we were just going to get rid of it, throw it out.
Yeah.
And so, we tried to interact with the community in those kinds of ways.
Yeah. That's good context too.
Yeah. Mike was a really good person to have for security reasons, in that he had several large rifles and is a bear hunter. And so,
Yeah. Wasn't afraid to hunt bear on the Doel
right,
Reed site.
yeah,
Is he still around?
yeah, yeah. Well, at least I'm pretty sure he is. I mean, I saw him a couple years ago, anyway. And his wife actually did our cleaning, but basically died on the property. Had a massive heart attack, and she died very young. And my wife and they had her funeral in the famous San Francisco de Assis church, the church that is the Rancho de Taos church that everybody has painted and photographed. George O'Keeffe, the back of it, and they had a marvelous bilingual mass with a choir singing folk songs, and there must have been 250 people there for her funeral, and my wife and I were the only Anglos.
Really? Wow.
Yeah. So a lot of Vietnam jackets, and in the congregation.
Interesting.
Taos and Santa Fe both lost a lot of people in Vietnam, and then in the Gulf and Afghanistan, just like a lot of Oklahomans.
Yeah.
For the same reason. My wife's father uh, lied about his age and signed up for the Marines when he was 16 in World War II to get out of. This is an odd coincidence. I applied just on the job list for a job at OSU, and my wife's father was born in Tryon.
Really? Gosh.
And his mother was the English teacher at Perkins Tryon, and his father was the football coach.
Oh my gosh, that's a really strange coincidence.
Isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, it's 7 miles from here and tiny.
Yep. Yeah, I always tell people it's a suburb of Perkins.
Yeah, that's strange.
Well, I don't really think I have anything to add.
Well, this has been really interesting. It's been really helpful to learn where you came into it, and also, all these different phases of it. Yeah,
Lots of decisions that had to be made.
lots of decisions. Yeah, and you're the one that knows why you got to make them.
Exactly.
Well, I hope that there's lots of future spaces where people are looking back and being like, how did these things get started and how did they get momentum? I hope we're asking those questions for a long, long time with the Doel Reed Center.
I do too.
Yeah.
And thanks for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. Yeah. My pleasure. All right. I'm going to go ahead and stop.